Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to all who've come tonight. It's a real privilege to be here. I know it's online, but I'm still present with you all, and I really appreciate it. These are two subjects that are very dear to my heart. I completed my PhD last year, so I've lived with this for the last 9 years of my life, and before that as well, but particularly in the last 9 years. And I think it's a hugely important topic that we need to discuss an awful lot more. So I'm very grateful that that we're having this platform tonight to do this. So as Miriam was saying, these are complicated histories, both of the Shoah and of the transatlantic slavery. And I've showed you some of the classic images here of Edward Colston's statue being removed. We can discuss later why it's chiefly young white people who are rolling this statue down the street, and then being toppled into Bristol Harbour with a resounding splash, which I think it resounded very deeply in this country because I think that splash, in many ways, it set off a debate on a much deeper level than we've ever had in this country about our colonial past, and particularly in relation to the slave trade and slavery. 400 years in the Caribbean, but it was over there and not here. And this is an interesting link also with the Shoah, in that in many ways it was over there and not here. And I want to kind of explore those things more as I go along. So we have a very uncomfortable past in that of slavery, and then we have the past of the Shoah, and the statue that Miriam's just mentioned of the Kindertransport, commemoration of the Kindertransport in Liverpool Street Station. A lot of the children came by train, would often arrive at Harwich, and then they come from Harwich down to Liverpool Street, hence the positioning of the statue in Liverpool Street. And it's an aspect that we do remember very much. Sir Nicholas Winton's name is often mentioned. He did an incredible, what he did was absolutely amazing. I in no way want to underestimate what he did at all, but I do want to, in this talk, explore some of the things that weren't done, because I think that, and Miriam has already touched on them, because I think these are things that need to be discussed as well in a public forum. Very briefly, memorialization of the Shoah in Europe has happened an awful lot more. I mean, the film by Claude Lanzmann is the most extraordinary film. He himself described it as a recreation. And it's a very, I mean, for those of you who've watched all of it, it's a very difficult piece of film to watch. I have watched 3 hours of it, and I just find it very, very hard to watch, because he films it in such a way. And I chose this particular, this is it's like the poster for the film, so to speak. But this man, this was a man whose story, through the recreation, really, it shocked me very profoundly, in that Claude Lanzmann talks to many, many different people, and they describe what's gone on. But this particular man that we see at the top of the screen, he actually drove the trains into Treblinka. And so Claude Lanzmann finds him a train, and he gets him to drive this train in exactly the way as he would have driven it, only about 20 or 30 years before this was actually filmed. And he drives and he's filmed, but then you start to realize that he's looking out the window, he's looking towards the front, and then he stops the train and he looks behind. There's no need to look behind, because there's nothing else on that track and there's nobody in the train. And yet you realize in that moment, this man has just gone straight back 30 years and is doing what he'd done when the trains were full of Jewish prisoners. And it's in that moment I understood what Claude Lanzmann meant when he said this is a recreation and not a documentary. And so certainly in France, there has been a real, certainly for Claude Lanzmann, I totally agree with Miriam, he was very instrumental in really making people start to talk about what happened. I've underneath the bottom of the screen on the right-hand side, I've shown the memorial in Treblinka, or part of the memorial in Treblinka, and also the Berlin Memorial, it's extraordinary. I went there a couple of years ago, and it's an extraordinary sight, because initially you can, when you start to walk into it, you can see above the top of these blocks, these stele. But then as you go further in, you can't see over them any longer. And it has an extraordinary, powerful impact. Any of you who've been there, I'm sure you'll understand what I'm talking about. So there has been a real memorialization of the Shoah in Europe. In this country, and I might be in contention, but to me, it's a very different story. We have the incredible Wiener Holocaust Library, which was established in 1949, who do a most amazing work of preserving and sharing and keeping on the agenda what happened between 1933 and 1945. They have a huge archive, both of oral stories, of recorded oral testimony, of written testimony, of books, and they work very hard. There's a constant program of exhibitions. We also have the Hyde Park Memorial, established in 1983, thanks to the Board of British Jews. But this is a memorial in the middle of Hyde Park, which is a huge place. And by various people's accounts, it's very actually hard to find. It's beautiful. And I'm very glad there is a memorial, but it's in a place where you don't necessarily ever go, to be quite honest, unless you're specifically looking for this. What's happened very recently, last year, Bianca Stigter, who is the wife of Steve McQueen, famous for the film 12 Years a Slave, amongst other very brilliant films, the Small Axe series that came out last year as well. And she has produced a film called 3 Minutes, A Lengthening, which it's basically a man called David Kurtz discovered in his grandfather's wardrobe, after his grandfather passed away, this box of film. And it turned out his grandfather had gone back to his hometown in Poland in 1938 and had filmed friends, family, people in the Jewish quarter of his hometown. And obviously 1938 was a very interesting time for filming in a Jewish quarter. And so there's been about 3 minutes of this film that the US Holocaust Memorial Museum was able to rescue, basically. But Bianca Stigter has taken these 3 minutes and she has expanded them, she has lengthened them. And so every tiny second almost of a still in the film, she explores and she starts to pull out what actually were the lives of these people. And they've managed to actually find the names of some of the people and have looked into the occupations, what was going on, what was happening. And it's the most incredible piece of film. But it seems to me, I think, and I could be wrong, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but in terms of a documentary, of a film that specifically looks at a very precise aspect of the Shoah, or rather what comes before the Shoah, this is a first within the UK. And then obviously have the Kindertransport statue. And then we sort of have a silence, really, because yes, we have Holocaust Memorial Day, but then, and the Holocaust is taught in the primary schools. That I know, because my son was taught about it towards the end of primary school, and they pick it up again in secondary school. So it is on the curriculum. But given this country's given how much this country fought in the Second World War, I think that might explain why we are very aware of the Holocaust, of the Shoah. But why do we not memorialize it much more? Yes, it's very true that Jews were not deported from the UK to Eastern Europe. That's very true. So in one sense, it didn't happen here. But are there other things going on? And so there has been this, so recently it was proposed about sort of 3, 4, 5 years ago to have a much bigger Holocaust Memorial Education Centre in Victoria Gardens in London, which is literally just behind the Houses of Parliament in a very beautiful little park that kind of runs along the side of the Thames. But this caused a furore. And there's a specific organisation set up, the Victoria Gardens, I think, Preservation Society, or can't remember the exact name, Victoria Gardens Society, that has fought to make sure this memorial was not placed in these gardens, arguing it's a beautiful space. And then they also had a legal reason in that there's the London County Council Improvements Act of 1900, which preserves green spaces and parks. It means you cannot build on them. And so in July 2022, the Court of Appeal ruled against the construction of this memorial. However, very interestingly, the British government, and this has been through various different prime ministers, starting with David Cameron, the British government has been very determined to see this memorial established. So in February 2023, the Holocaust Memorial Bill was put to Parliament to circumvent this 1900 Act. It's currently on the second reading in the House of Commons. So what will happen eventually? There's certainly a real determination from the British government this would be established. My question is, in this memorial, this Holocaust Memorial and Education Centre, what will be memorialised? The UK government's role during the Second World War, apart from the obvious, which is we have to remember, because I think this is a very important point as well, that increasingly it could become easy to forget. And this sounds absolutely horrendous and horrific, but the more I read, the more I realize that a lot of people are very concerned this can actually happen. That is, it just can go on people's back burners, and yet it was so horrendous and on such a scale. I agree very much with what Mike said at the beginning, that I think the Holocaust, there are very unique aspects to the Holocaust that we have to always bear in mind. And I totally agree that I wouldn't want to start doing some kind of, comparative with transatlantic slavery to see who suffered most. I just think there's something very abhorrent, I think, about that approach, intellectually and morally. But I do want to ask, apart from what really must be memorialised, what else is going to be memorialised in this centre? The UK government's role during the Second World War, the Kindertransport. But then when we talk about the UK government's role during the Second World War, we can talk not just about what the British Army did as part of the Allied armies to eventually liberate these, the death camps and the concentration camps, but what do we do in this country in terms of actually allowing Jewish people to come to this country as refugees? Because there was a visa requirement that was installed that had been in place and it was not removed at all. And so though there's a brilliant book written by Louise London called The Jews in Whitehall. It's a absolutely eye-opening book and very shocking, in that you realize that that it was by no way an open door through which Jewish refugees could come into this country. You had to have a visa, you had to have a sponsor, there was money involved. The Jewish community, and in fact, when the non-Jewish community became aware what was going on, they also contributed, but vast sums of money were raised in order for Jewish refugees to have sponsors in this country to be able to actually come over here. And when you look, even after Kristallnacht, this was still happening, that there was no change in the policy, and yet Kristallnacht made it very, very clear, if it hadn't already become clear, as to what Hitler and his party intended to do. People who came over here, Jewish refugees came over here, often they actually answered advertisements in the paper. They came over as domestic workers. As you heard from Miriam, those who were here already and those who came over found themselves in internment camps. And so there was there were the aspects to what happened in this country during the Second World War, specifically relating to Jewish people, and just before the Second World War, even more pertinently, maybe, that actually are very difficult aspects to look at, I think, from a UK perspective, because the UK government does not come out covered in roses, to be really honest. And so I think this is something, I think maybe this is partly why there's a hesitancy somewhere to talk about the Shoah, because there's stuff that should have been done, I think, in this country that wasn't done. And we see this whole attitude towards refugees being repeated again and again and again. Some of the things that have been said concerning small boats crossing the channel have, to me, been absolutely horrific, because to me, it's just linked into so many other things that I've heard if you go back, 70 odd years. So I think this, in a sense, this also taps into how this country sees the other, however you wish to define the other. And you can certainly tap into what Miriam has already referred to, the anti-Semitism that is most definitely present in this country. However, when I was researching for this presentation and looking at the Victoria Tower Gardens, where they want to have the new Holocaust Memorial Center, there's the Buxton Memorial drinking fountain, which you can see on the right hand of the photograph. Now, in fact, this drinking fountain commemorates the emancipation of enslaved Africans in the British Empire in 1834, following the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. And so, in a most extraordinary coincidence, we're going to have a monument to the Shoah, a memorial center, next to a monument which commemorates the emancipation. It was aimed at those people who were the white people. There's no mention of Olado Equiana in this monument at all, but people like William Wilberforce and Granville Sharp, they are mentioned in this monument. This is a monument to these people, the white people. The black people also contributed very powerfully in the abolitionist movement, aren't mentioned. And so this monument was completed in 1866 and was placed originally in Parliament Square, and it was placed in Victoria Tower Gardens in 1959. And so we have, by a very strange coincidence, in one sense, this juxtaposition of the Shoah and slavery. And this is what I want to come on to. So how do we remember transatlantic slavery in this country? The short answer is with a lot of pain and also a lot of forgetfulness. It's been very easy to forget, in inverted commas, because it all happened over there, like I mentioned previously. If you read, for example, Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, it's famous in that slavery permeates the whole book, but it happens in the Caribbean. The owner of Mansfield Park goes to the Caribbean to his plantation. Then he comes back, and then he goes again with his son. And so, but it happens over there. We're never taken over there, and we never see it. And so I think it's really been since the beginning of decolonization, really in the 1960s on, that's in America in particular, with the civil rights movement, you start to see people writing fiction to do with slavery. And gradually in this country, we are seeing it as well. There's been a real shift. And so we have this poem by Fred Daguerre, who is of Guyanese heritage, but who spent a lot of his life in this country. He now lives in America, and this is a poem that I think in many ways sums up slavery. Mama Dot, born on a Sunday in the kingdom of Shanti, sold on Monday into slavery, run away on Tuesday 'cause she born free, lost a foot on Wednesday when they catch she, worked all Thursday till her head grey, dropped on Friday where they burned she, freed on Saturday in a new century. So we have poetry, we have fiction, we have Sankofa Day. And I want to explore these a bit more. So books like The Book of Night Women, The Long Song by Andrea Levy, a recent book, River Sing Me Home by Eleanor Shearer. And they're just three examples I wanted to put in as examples of fiction that seeks to recreate the experience of the enslaved African in the Caribbean. Then we have Sankofa Day, which is an annual memorial in London Trafalgar Square, hosted by Slavery Remembrance to remember the 20 and more million victims of human trafficking during the 400 years of transatlantic slavery. Some people often you'll find a slightly lower figure, more like around 12 million, but 12 million is still an awful lot of people. And so on the 23rd of August is the International Day for the Remembrance of the slave trade and its abolition. But again, it's not, Miriam Davis mentioning the need for a national day against racism, but we have, for example, a day to remember the slave trade and its abolition, but how much is this day actually celebrated in the sense of the recognition and of what actually happened? This is not something that gets broadcast. We don't see this, on television like we saw it yesterday. That is very clear. However, very interestingly, and I think this is where the impact of Black Lives Matter has also been huge in this country. In March this year, Mayor Sadiq Khan, like Miriam mentioned, announced £500,000 for a project, which involved not just the erection of a memorial to slavery in London Docklands, near where the statue of Robert Milligan was removed. This is just next to the Museum of London Docklands, where this statue is. And obviously, this is where the ships came in from the Caribbean to unload the sugar, the rum, the molasses, and they were stored in the buildings where you now have the Museum of London Docklands. And obviously, there are many more buildings as well, which have since been removed. Not only this memorial to slavery, but also going to be multiple satellite projects around London. They want to work with artists, they want to work with local communities, and they want to really memorialize slavery and what happened. And I do believe it's very much a result of the impact of of Black Lives Matter, that really started to bring in this debate. Because enough, there has been a community group for a long time that have been raising funds. They were promised some money by Boris Johnson, which never materialized, and they wanted to have it in Hyde Park, interestingly enough. And it would have been the first national memorial in the UK to commemorate the enslaved Africans and their descendants, but it's never happened. But now with Sadiq Khan's intervention, I really hope that we will see a memorial to what happened. So I'll stop sharing there, but I wanted to kind of go back to something that Mike said at the very beginning. I think to bring these two horrendous historical processes together, yes, it's very true. We could look at other horrendous historical processes of that. Sadly, tragically, there's no doubt. But I think what I find very interesting is when you start to analyze what actually goes on between the Shoah and transatlantic slavery, the number of parallels, like I said, my idea of connectivity is if you can think of two rivers that run parallel, and they come, they join, they move apart, and they come and they join again. There are some very important differences, which for me, one of the most major differences is why these things happened. In terms of the Shoah, it was a policy to actually get rid of every Jewish person in Europe, if not in the world. Whereas, so the idea was extinction. Whereas with transatlantic slavery, the idea was to get them to work and to create profits. As a consequence of being worked to death, a lot of African people died. Millions died in horrendous circumstances. But there were there's a very important difference between the actual motivation behind. However, when you start to unpack it more, you realize, okay, there's also a difference in time span between 1933 to 1945. Whereas with transatlantic slavery, you can start roughly in the early 1500s, and you can go on till, depending on what European country you're dealing with, up to the 1860s, even later. So, but when you start to look at the actual principles that operate behind it, the deportation, the loss of your family, your country, your religion, your faith, even more importantly, your language, you are enslaved, remembering that there were both the concentration camps and the death camps, and how many Jewish people were, how many millions of Jewish people were enslaved before they met their death, so that the fact of enslavement isn't just, within transatlantic slavery by a very long shot. And you start to see these absolutely, horrendous parallels in what happens in both these historical processes. And I think they do shed light on each other very much, because you start to realize there's something that's going on behind all this. And this is where I argued in my thesis that, for me, the matrix behind both these historical processes is colonialism. Because we often, in this country, the way I see the history of the Second World War is, it's the blitzkrieg. It's the fact that there's this campaign to defeat the Nazi forces, but we don't look at, well, what was Hitler's actual? We don't look nearly so much at what was Hitler's motivation. And you realize when you start to read it, he actually wanted to establish, the Third Reich. He did want to rule the world. However mad that might be, That was the bottom line of what he was trying to do, and also get rid of anybody who he didn't like, who he felt didn't fit into his concept of what was suitably to be found on this earth. Um, and and obviously slavery was completely and utterly funded by colonialism. The fact that this country and other European countries as well could go into the Caribbean and to the Americas in order to exploit both the land, the indigenous people, and the African peoples who were brought across. But it was the colonialism was behind that whole process as well. And so, and that's what I would put to you, that actually we have to look at colonialism as a matrix from which these very damaging historical processes ultimately issued. Yes, there were different factors that we have to bring, we have to acknowledge. I totally agree. And I think they're we must not deny them. But I think to actually start examining in some more detail what really went on, it casts some very shocking light on both processes, which I think desperately need to be examined. We have to be honest with ourselves. I think Miriam, or I can't remember if it was Miriam or Mike, but one of you said how these impact to this day. And I think we can look not just at the racism against people of color in this country, but also the racism against Jewish people. These are huge problems, and problems in the right word. These are things that are structurally embedded into this country's view on life, so to speak. It's systemic, and that's why it's so dangerous and so poisonous. And so I really think, yes, we really must examine both these things, both these historical processes, in order to really start looking at where are we at as a country. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you.